Paul doesn't believe that Jesus was ever a human being. He's not even aware of the idea. And he's the link between the time frame given for the life of Jesus and the appearance of the first gospel account of that life. This is why you don't hear many Christian leaders talking about the early days of Christianity. Because once you assemble the facts, the story is that Jesus lived, everyone forgot, and then they remembered.
In other portions of the film, this filmmaker refers to being brought up in a Christian environment, going to a Christian school. And yet I have to wonder how he hasn't heard of the book of Acts. He asserts that early church members and churches don't refer to what happened after Jesus was crucified and in AD 70 when he asserts that the Gospels were written. I have to say that church leaders are always talking about that period. The book of Acts, which is in the New Testament, covers this period and refers to what the early church does and refers to most of the historical information we have about Paul. So I really have to wonder, has this guy really read the Bible? So we've already caught our narrator a number of times, either misquoting or totally, I don't want to say lying, but giving blatantly false information that the truth is actually a complete contradiction to what he's saying. So, of course, we're interested in seeing how he's going to go next to this, but already we've kind of shown that he hasn't really researched what he's having to say. So let's see what he says next.
But it gets even shakier than that. Allegorical literature was extremely common back then.
This is just a simulation. This is just a simulation.
Mark himself probably did not believe he was writing history. He was writing a symbolic message. He was writing a gospel, the good news, and symbolizing it using, biblical parallels, using parallels to pagan religions and so forth.
There really isn't any reason to believe that what the gospel writers were writing was allegorical. At the end of John, at the beginning of 1 John, John's epistle, and also Peter referred to the history of what they're referring to. Paul refers to 1 Corinthians 15, to the history of what he's recording, and how all the apostles had backed up and verified the facts that he was speaking of, the crucifixion and resurrection. So there's really no reason to believe that what they're speaking about is allegory. They pay careful attention to details, to places, to events, and much of the New Testament has been backed up by history after the fact. So any historian who is looking at the Bible, although they would certainly have some trouble examining the miracles and wondering, okay, well, is this true? Is this false? Is this made up? They would generally look at the Gospels as accurate, just as historians have done with the Old Testament, which is why you never see documentaries on TV saying, oh, the Old Testament's all just a bunch of lies, or oh, the Gospel's all just a bunch of lies. All they try to do is spin it. So they'll never say that, okay, the Exodus didn't happen. They'll just say, well, maybe the Red Sea crossing didn't really happen that way. Maybe there's a naturalistic explanation. The reason is because they're aware that the Old Testament and the Gospels are valid history that have been supported by history and archaeology.
There are these other Gospels, and there are the Apocrypha, after all. There are apocryphal New Testament and apocryphal Old Testament stories that were too folkloristic, and they got thrown out because people thought these couldn't have happened, therefore we get rid of them.
Not true, Alan Dundes. Those writings actually came much later in the church than the Gospels. The Gospels are written, I believe, by AD 60. I'd say by AD 70, because John, I think, came a little bit later, but was not at AD 90, which is where some scholars want to assert. In fact, secular scholars used to assert it was written in the mid-2nd century until they actually found papyrus that proved that it was written probably around AD 90. So the reason that they weren't thrown out. They were actually just weren't accepted by the early church because they already had the Gospels they needed. They had already seen the truth that they had examined. They'd already spoken to the apostles and were able to verify the Gospels as truth. These other stories came later by people who were teaching doctrine that contradicted what the apostles were teaching as the doctrine of Jesus.
But, of course, some of the apocryphal stories are as interesting as the regular Bible.
So they kept in walking on water and rising from the dead, but the others, those were not too outlandish. There have been
attempts to it's called demythologizing. There have been attempts mostly by Jesuits and other intellectuals who say, who are upset by the in a sense, the folklore, if you like. And they say, let's make this more intellectual. Let's get rid of the folklore. Let's get rid of the virgin birth, which it seems unlikely. Let's get rid of all this stuff. But of course, if you take away the folklore away from the Bible, you don't have a heck of a lot left except begat, 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 begat.
Well, in the case of someone like Caesar Augustus, around whom many of the same myths clustered, we know there nonetheless was a Caesar Augustus because he's intricately tied into the history of the time, and many secular historians talk about it. You can't rewrite history without Caesar Augustus. But at the very 2 points, Jesus appears to be locked into history. These stories are either still mythical, like the slaughter of the innocents derived right out of the book of Exodus, or they contain outrageous improbabilities, such as the Jewish Supreme Council meeting on Passover Eve to get rid of these guys. It's just out of the question.
I love the 2 examples he used because they actually are supported by history, funny enough. The description of Herod slaughtering the innocent children, which he said was so outlandish and folklorish, actually is backed up in history by Macrobius, which he writes in Saturnalia 2:4-11, when Augustus heard that Herod, king of the Jews, had ordered all the boys in Syria under the age of 2 to be put to death, and that the king's son was among those killed, he said, "I'd rather be Herod's pig than Herod's son." Jesus' trial on Passover Eve is backed up by the Talmud, which is a Jewish source that's basically the rabbinical writings. And they are about as old as the New Testament, maybe a little newer. Some of them more newer than older, but they can go back about that far. The Talmud actually refers to Yeshua of Nazareth's trial on Passover Eve, his mother Miriam, which we translated to Mary, as well as his miracles, which it refers to as sorceries, because the Jewish leaders did not view Yeshua or Jesus as the Messiah. So the interesting thing is, his assertion that, there would be no trial on Passover Eve, the assertion that Price had, is absolutely false. The Talmud backs it up. And that's a Jewish source. They had no reason to lie to support Christianity.
Or Pontius Pilate letting go a known killer of Romans and insurrectionist, Barabbas, and just letting Jesus be thrown to the mob after, however, trying to get him off the hook as if he has to have a vote on it. It just defies any kind of historical verisimilitude. And then when you realize, there were other ancient Jews and Jewish Christians that believed Jesus had been killed a century before under King Alexander Jannaeus. Or in the Gospel of Peter, it says that Herod had Jesus killed.
First of all, the Gospel of Peter is not in the Bible. It's an apocryphal source. The speaker didn't mention that. But even so, the filmmaker has once again shown that he doesn't really know too much about the Bible or history by saying, when they say that Herod killed Jesus, that must be 0 AD. Because he's thinking that when he says Herod, he's referring to the Herod who was there when Jesus was born and ordered, or tried to order his death. The problem is the Gospel of Peter doesn't clarify which Herod it is. There were a number of Herods, including a Herod who was involved in Jesus' death. And Peter actually does mention that Herod being involved in his death in the book of Acts. So once again, the filmmaker, moving along with Price, have sort of propagated some false understandings to confuse the issue and discredit Christianity.